Hey everyone, I'm Avi Klein,
I'm Sam Graham-Felsen.
and you're listening to Hey Man, the Advice Podcast for Men. Each week we answer one of your questions and hopefully get a few of our own questions answered as well. And this week, we're really pleased to be joined by Adam Frankel. Adam's a former Obama speechwriter and the author of the memoir, The Survivors, a story of war, inheritance, and healing. Adam writes really beautifully and movingly about his experience growing up in the third generation after the Holocaust and the impact that the Holocaust had on his family and his mother growing up as a descendant of Holocaust survivors. It's a really touching book about identity and about family secrets, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I was just really touched by Adam's honesty, his vulnerability, and if there's a theme to his book and this conversation, at least one of them is the ways in which the truth can set you free. Enjoy.
Adam, thank you for coming to talk about your new memoir, The Survivors. This is a book that kept me up at night. I read it late into the night, and I don't normally do that because I have two little kids, and reading late into the night is not a good
Sleep
idea.
Sleep is precious. You just need to. Yeah.
But I was totally riveted by the book, and
Thank you.
I mean, it's an amazing story. It's very well told and beautifully written, but it's also just something on a personal level that I connected to. I guess not as on the same level you are, but I guess I would consider myself like a 3G person, which is third generation Holocaust descendant.
Yeah.
My grandparents, my father's side, were among the last people to escape Germany after Kristallnacht. But my grandfather's store was destroyed in Kristallnacht. His sister was killed by the Nazis. A lot of his family members were killed, but he was able to get out. I think on one of those extraordinary talent visas. He had a relative in the U.S. who helped hook that up. But certainly for me, like a big thing that I've struggled with in my life has been anxiety, and I think a lot of it is related to some of the trickle-down effects of what it was like for my father to grow up with two Holocaust refugees. Again, not survivors. They weren't in camps like your grandfather was.
How do you see that trickling down to you? How do you make sense of that?
Well, I mean, I'll just give a quick example because I want this to be about Adam. But for my grandfather, the fact that he escaped and like his sister was killed, and obviously a lot of his friends and family were killed too, just gave him a tremendous sense of survivor's guilt. So he just never spent money on himself, or and he was a professor. He made a good salary, but I mean, he ended up saving lots and lots of money just on a professor's salary because he never spent money on himself. I remember when he was very prominent in his field of physics, and he won this major award. And we went out to dinner to celebrate, and he literally cried when he saw that the bill was like over $100 for like it wasn't even that fancy of a place.
Yeah.
And I was like mad at him. I think I was 18 or 19 at the time, and I was like, "You got to enjoy this, man!" Like, and he's like, "You don't understand. I can't enjoy this."
Yeah, and actually, and on the flip side, any sadness or pain is sort of pushed to the side, because how can you feel sad or pained about something given what your parents and family went through?
Totally.
You shouldn't be allowed to feel that way. So that had to be kind of suppressed.
Yeah.
So you're kind of from both sides of it.
Really
you experience that. I mean, one of the people that I interviewed in the book is a woman named Yael Danieli, who sort of a pioneer of intergenerational trauma research, edited the sort of handbook on this stuff decades ago, and was one of the first people to look at and help treat the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And to paraphrase her, I mean, part of the way she talks about it is it's not about whether people experience the impacts of this trauma. It's who and how intensely. Mm-hmm. And she has sort of a classification system for thinking about that. But yeah, no, I mean, this stuff is real. And how could it not be, right? Yeah. I mean, that's how could the traumas that are so profound not have these major effects on us generations later?
It sort of seems like, I mean, I guess I'm thinking like World War I and soldiers coming back from that, but then certainly the Holocaust seem like the two historical events where as a society and a culture we were waking up to what trauma is.
Right. Yeah. PTSD used to be called shell shock after World War I.
Shell shock, right? Combat fatigue.
Yeah.
And World War II, the most violent cataclysm in human history. And as I start talking to people about this book, everyone has World War II. Everyone has a story of how World War II trauma has impacted their family, both whether, wholly apart from Holocaust trauma, which is sort of in a way gave rise to a lot of the research around intergenerational trauma. But wholly apart from the Holocaust experience, just people who fought survived, and even who were back home and had lost loved ones and dealt with all of that. And just the way the trauma has, reverberated, I think is very powerful, and everyone has that experience.
One of the things I was really struck by in your book was your wife called you an emotional tundra, which my wife has didn't give me that exact nickname, but has levied similar charges against me at times. But I think you're right that without generalizing about all 3G kids, but like I grew up certainly suspect of emotion. I think it wasn't what the prized value that I received from my parents, which I am very grateful for, was I think the value you got, which is resilience. Which is like we survived.
You think is that resilience or stoicism?
It might be stoicism, and that's worth parsing. But I think but it was certainly like a sense of like, we don't give up. We're fighters.
You can get through this.
We can get through this. But I do agree with you that stoicism, it had a stoical edge to it because the tricky part of it was, if you get sad, not only that might be indulgent, but it might be
dangerous.
It might be dangerous, because imagine if your relatives had wasted time bemoaning their fate. They might have died in the Holocaust
showing
instead
weakness.
of surviving.
Don't show weakness. No signs of weakness are tolerated, permitted. It's to your point, it's dangerous.
Yeah. So the bulk of the book is actually less about your grandparents and more about your mother. And that was also something that, growing up with a mother who struggled with depression and mental illness, also contributed to your kind of feeling like this sense of instability, this sense of unpredictability, and the adaptation that you understandably made for yourself was like to kind of build a wall around yourself emotionally.
Yeah.
And I guess like the biggest thing I wanted to ask you just right out of the bat was like you are someone who has worked in politics. You were a speechwriter for Obama for his campaign, went to the White House. The first thing I felt reading this book right away is like, this is not on message. This is not on message.
There's nothing on message about this book.
You're not only revealing some really things that I'm sure were embarrassing for you to reveal about yourself, but you're talking about people that you love in a way that is really honest and critical. And I'm just wondering, like, how the hell did you make that leap, being someone who spent so long in politics where you're conditioned to do the opposite, to do what you did here?
Well, and you're right, I was conditioned. I mean, I'd worked obviously on as you mentioned, on the Obama campaign. I worked on the Kerry campaign. I'd interned in the White House for when I was in college for Bill Clinton. I'd wanted to work in politics, and so it's hard. I mean, I think that the truth is, and the bottom line is, I needed to write the book. It was very clear to me early on as I was grappling with this, early on in the writing process, not early on in grappling with this, because in 2006, I learned that my dad is not my biological father. And this was a secret that my mother had kept from me, from my dad, from our whole family. And I continue to keep the secret from my dad for almost a decade. And I buried it deep down, and it was only much, much later that I started thinking about the idea of writing about this. I mean, I couldn't have for more than a decade, really. Or I should say, for about a decade, the idea of writing a book about this would have been unthinkable to me. But as I started to sort of find my way through this and started writing about it, I realized how essential it was to being able to make my way through it and understand what had happened, understand this revelation and all of the crazy circumstances that led to it, and all the insane sort of family details I learned about my biological father, about how his relationship with my mother, the ugly way in which his relationship with my mother started, just making sense of all this. Writing about it helped, and it was critical for me to sort of see my way through it. And I kind of made a decision as I recognized that the chips were just going to fall where they were going to fall, and that I just needed to write it, and that I would have family members who were upset, as I do, that I'm writing this book, that I would be worried about my mother's reaction as I am, worried about my dad's reaction as I'm not as much anymore because they both read it. But that I just needed to do this for myself, and not just for myself, for my family, because this had been such a disruptive thing in my life and my relationship with Steph, my wife, with our family. I've got 2 young kids, and wanting to be present for them, and also wanting to try and show people who are going through their own kind of experiences with a revelation like this or any other form of trauma, that there's sort of a path through it. And so I kind of decided I was just going to be as honest as I could, and that was the most important thing, and that all the other stuff I'd kind of figure out afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading the book, I was struck by just the layers of you come from a family that relied a lot on secrecy, to sort of maintain the status quo, and a lot of family loyalty, and so it's a pretty courageous thing to write a book like this that I think is in the spirit of healing, but is very much about openness and transparency, and could be considered disloyal.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's the Spinal Tap line. There's a fine line between clever and stupid. It's like there's a fine line between brave and stupid on this, and courageous and brave. I mean, I think I know certain family members do consider this an act of disloyalty. They've said as much to me.
So they, I was struck by that. I want to hear what you have to say, but it was striking to me that you seemed so alone in your family, in sort of like you were so aware of the consequences of living with secrecy. And other people that did not seem clear on how they might have suffered also.
No. No. I mean, it's amazing how they're trapped. I have love for my family members, even the ones who've not always been supportive of me. But there is a way in which it sometimes seems like not all of them fully see or want to see the ways in which what their parents experienced, the way it affected them. They to your question about being on message, Sam, I mean, it's as if saying anything negative is disloyal. I had a cousin, one of my cousins called me, I think probing about what I was going to say in the book. And she said, and I said I was writing about Bubby and Zeta and their experience in the war and the legacy of the trauma. And she's like, well, I mean, you're not going to talk about anything negative, are you? And I'm like, they didn't do anything negative. And it's sort of like, well, what a weird, that didn't have any negative impact or something like that. She said, I thought, what a weird thing to say. It's like, it's the Holocaust. Okay.
And it's life.
It's life. It's going to have like negative effects.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was sort of like struck by the way, the way she put it. And so there is this kind of like, head in the sand approach to some of this stuff that is that, and I see it in my generation, in my family, the way in which that kind of approach just creates more problems. It's like, I think I reflect on this in the book, but it's sort of like, if we just had a much more open and transparent and honest way of being as a family, we would have spared so much heartache. Forget me, my mom wrestling with mental health issues and all this secrecy that they put around that stuff. I mean, my mom would have been better off. The whole family would have been better off.
If you don't mind talking about it, I am curious, like, I'm sure everyone's going to ask you this as you do your book events, what your parents thought of it and what those conversations were like.
Yeah, well, I was talking recently with a friend who's a therapist, and she was saying that the book helped. She works with a lot of people who have parents who have depressed and borderline personality disorder, and was saying that her hope was and her thought was the book might be helpful for them because not a lot of people don't write about this from the perspective of the child for the reason that you're stating. They're terrified of what the mother or what father, whatever, how they'll react. And so there's not a lot research, is what she was saying. And I mean, from the beginning of the moment I decided to write about all of this, I was absolutely terrified. Her reaction, my mother's reaction has been, has run the gamut. So I gave her the book and I didn't hear anything for several days. And so
this must have been a long several days.
It was a long several days. And so at a certain point I called her up, and she picked up and she just said, "Hi, how are you?" And she started talking as if I hadn't given her the book. Right. And she's just asking about the kids and all this kind of stuff. I was like, "Well, so, have you read any of the book?" She's like, "Oh yeah, I finished it." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Is there, you want to talk about it?" "No, not unless you do." "Oh, okay." And that was that reaction. Okay. I was like, well, another shoe's going to drop here. And so it has run the gamut. So there was that reaction. She said to me that I'm very proud of you for writing it, which I thought was very gracious and I appreciated. We had an hour and a half long subsequent conversation that was, where she expressed her displeasure at a number of the things that I said and wrote about, and we went through them sort of item by item. So it has kind of evolved. It has totally run the gamut.
It's like the beginning. It's the beginning of a long conversation.
And look, I understand it. I mean, it's incredibly personal. I'm sharing a lot of very uncomfortable stuff about her, wholly apart from the sort of mental health issues that she's grappled with her whole life, and I think still does. It would be uncomfortable for anybody to have their son, a family member, share such intimate personal details, and so I empathize with that perspective. My dad was very nervous about it. I mean, in the beginning, he never asked me not to write it, but he asked me to just make sure to think about it.
What was he nervous about?
He was nervous. It's just so personal, that his son isn't his biological son. This was a secret. He was cuckolded by this guy. It made him, I think, feel, less than somehow of a man, of a husband. I don't know. I mean, at one point, I don't actually put this in the book, but at one point, when my dad told my mother's father, my Zeta, a long time ago when my parents were splitting, around the time my parents were splitting, that my mom, your daughter, Gershon is my grandfather's name. Your daughter has been having, an affair. And my grandfather said to my dad, "Well, I don't know about that, but if she is, it's your fault." And I think my dad is just sort of this heaviness has just kind of just lived with him for a long time. But he said to me after reading it, he said, "You salvaged me." He said,
"That makes me want to cry."
Oh God, I mean, tell me about it. He said, he's a great book lover. So he quoted, referencing Dante. He said, "You were my Virgil, leading me through the darkest parts of my life."
Wow.
And seeing me through to the other side. I mean, it was really so powerful, and very emotional to hear him say that. And I said to him, as I was writing it, trying to reassure him, Dad, you're the hero here. You're the hero of my book. You're the hero of my life. But it's so personal. I think he now, having read it and beginning to see people's reactions from within the family and outside, and just how supportive and loving. I mean, I could get emotional talking about this, but how supportive and loving people are. His perspective on it has fully come around, but it was tough for him for a long time.
Wow. Yeah, I felt like he was the hero, one of the heroes of the book, and the moment where you finally tell him and his response to you, and then like sort of learning about how he's shouldered this burden for so long. Yeah.
No, I mean it was a lot, I mean, it's still, I get choked up. I mean, it's still very raw for me.
I'm there with you,
because it's so intense and profound and not that long ago. I mean, that's the truth. I kept my true identity a secret from my dad for almost a decade and only told him in 2014. That's not that long ago.
No. Yeah.
And I had family members who didn't know about this until months ago. His siblings, my aunt and uncle, didn't know that I wasn't his biological son until a few months ago.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is still very raw and new. And, my biological father, I have a whole half family there.
Right.
Most of them don't even know about me.
Yeah.
So we changed his name in the book, but it's not, they're going to know. And so there are all those repercussions, which will no doubt follow.
I was kind of wondering, just based on something you just said, like about living with this for so long.
Yeah.
And, when I work with a lot of men, like I've heard this so many times that it's like, it just must be a thing for guys. Like a lot of straight men are envious of gay men and the experience of coming out because a lot of them feel like people don't really know me, or like there's like a truth about me, my whole self. I'm just keeping it to myself. And I was just thinking, like, you've had this experience of getting to be more of yourself. And I wondered if it felt like that at all.
It does. For the first time, I mean, I feel more grounded and sure of who I am now than I have ever in my whole life. But this whole experience, I have a stepbrother. My dad remarried a number of years ago to an amazing woman, and she has a son from a previous marriage. And I was never that close to him growing up. We were separated by too many years, never grew up in the same place. But he came out to my dad and his mom shortly after my conversation with my dad. And I remember when I called him up when I was working on this book just to share this with him, my experience with him, we almost bonded over that experience. And it was in a way that caught me by surprise, because we both had this truth about our identity that we had not shared with the world,
right,
and with our loved ones. And we didn't know how they would react. I think we had a different perspective and levels of fear or whatever. We came at it obviously very differently, but in a fundamental way, we had this truth about ourselves that we had kept to ourselves. And that process of holding on to it for so much of our lives and then sharing it and then being sort of liberated on the other side of it was an amazing moment of connection between us. I mean, the most profound connection and closest I think I've ever felt to him was in that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wasn't making that same analogy in my head that Avi was making about sort of coming out, but I was thinking throughout this conversation that a decade to carry a secret that heavy must have weighed on you. There was just a small detail that was funny on some level, but also just very telling. Just when you talk about being in the speechwriter's room with John Lovett, who's now the famous co-host of Pod Save America, and him being like, "Can you stop sighing all the time?"
Classic,
But I'm just imagining that must have taken a physical toll on your body too. And like, do you actually feel like a sense of almost being a lighter person now?
Yeah. I mean, and Steph has commented on that. I mean, as I've told, now we're at a point where, like, I wrote a book, I'm talking to people about it. And so it's diminishing returns in a sense of lightness.
Right.
But especially a lot of those early conversations, she could tell a physical change in me.
Wow.
After she could certainly tell after I had that conversation with my father, but then even subsequent conversations with family members I was very close to, who I opened up to about this, she would comment to me about how you seem different, you seem lighter. Absolutely, and it did take a physical toll. I mean, it just played out. I describe as I was sort of reflecting on the whole journey and writing about it, some of the turmoil it created in my life, personally, professionally, and showing up to work one day and love it being like, well, you look like shit. I think I put that in the book. And I didn't, and we went out to lunch and I talked to him. I didn't share any of this, but it absolutely, it took a toll physically. And then when you think about that and you think about my mom carrying this secret for decades,
Wow.
I mean, that's the part to me that's sort of like, I have strong views on whether she should have done that. She should not have, but I can at the same time sympathize with that and empathize with what a cost that might have taken her to hold on to this secret for all those years. I held on to it for about a decade. She held on to it for 25 years. By the way, I mean, to the extent there's stuff that still kind of gets me a little fired up, it is she never would have told me. I mean, that's still the part that kind of grates on me.
It's kind of a
had I not
bizarre
confronted
thing.
her on it.
It's kind of bizarre to think about it this way, but you figured it out. And that's I mean, it's a very powerful moment in the book where you just confront her and ask her head on because you figured it out basically. But it's kind of almost a bizarre stroke of luck now that I think about it that you did figure it out because your life will probably be a lot better than it would have been had you had that secret never.
Totally, and that's the thing, I mean, these forms. I don't have to tell you guys. I mean, you're a therapist, so like the
very sympathetic.
Obvious therapist. If you don't deal with these things, they rear their head in all kinds of different ways, and that's part of what kind of I realized about. Even after learning the truth, I buried my own head in the sand and didn't really want to deal with it. And then I started to realize that it was creating all kinds of disruption in my life, and that was in some ways the source of it. And if I didn't face it head on, it would throw my whole life out of whack for the rest of my life. And I wasn't willing to let that happen. So that's what kind of was the impetus for me to start confronting it.
Adam, there's one part of the book that is actually about your dad that I don't know. I was just struck by this part. I wonder if you could read it.
My conversations with Jason were clarifying. Over the years, I've heard various versions of the question. Doesn't everything that happened, the cheating, the secret baby, somehow reflect poorly on your dad? I know where the question comes from. Dad had been cuckolded, and in some eyes, that makes him seem weak, like less of a man. Dad certainly doesn't look like a tough guy. He's rather slim, mild-mannered, and earnestly curious about people and the world. And as a boy, there were times I wanted him to display some of the more conventional attributes of toughness and strength. During a trip to Cooperstown, we met up with a friend of mine who was there with his own father to visit the Baseball Hall of Fame, and we challenged each other to a friendly game of pool, one father-son pair against the other. I was certain Dad and I would win. Grandma and Pa had a pool table in their basement, and I'd grown up admiring my dad's game, a gentle game, subtle angles, soft pushes. My friend's father, by contrast, was a former college athlete and practically snapped the cue in half with every shot, the crack resounding across the pool hall. We got our asses kicked. Such conventional notions of strength and weakness, of manhood, seem entirely inapt, however, for understanding Jason's and my dad's respective roles in this whole saga. And it raises all the age-old questions about what constitutes strength and weakness, what it means to be a man. Jason had an inappropriate relationship with a vulnerable, less powerful woman. Does that reflect strength? Is that what a real man does? Dad was faithful to my mom, vowing to help her heal and repair her relationships with Bubby and Zeta. does that reflect weakness? Are we comfortable saying that's not what a man should do?
So I guess I wanted you to read that. I mean, in part, I think it kind of encapsulates exactly what this show is trying to interrogate, like that question of, is that what a man should do? And we do actually take seriously the ideas of kind of like, quote unquote, traditional masculinity and physical strength and, you know, things
kind
like
of wanting to be the guy who wins the pool game.
Yeah. But the real reason that I wanted you to read that, I was just struck by the pool table thing. And, you know, it just made me think about my own feelings about my dad when I was a kid, wishing that he would have been the kind of guy to snap the cue almost in half with every shot. And he wasn't that kind of guy, but, you know, but he did all of these other, you know, he was the guy who did the finessing and the soft touches and things like that. And
funny, my dad was closer to that guy.
I know. That's why we have opposite issues. That's why I want to be the tough guy and you want to be the softie. But I think, I don't know. I was just, I definitely think that your dad comes off as the hero in this book, and you know, look, that term cuckold, right? Like it's such a, I mean, it must be hard for you to even hear that word out loud. It's hard for me to hear it out loud. And that's something that the alt-right has really, like, the word cuck has become their main epithet for an emasculated man. And it's such utter bullshit.
And the term itself it's so, you know, in this context, it's just, it's so messed up. I mean, it's like, think about the context in which what we're talking about here. I mean, in my case, I'll just take my case. We're talking about a woman, my mother, who was hospitalized for a suicide attempt, for weeks. Practically killed herself, and very close to killing herself. And a couple years later, a professor, more than a decade older, preys on her, in my view, and in my mother's. I mean, you know, and in by his own admission, I mean, he said to me that he was attracted to my mother because he was attracted to broken women.
Right.
My dad is trying to help my mom when they met. You know, empathizes, sympathizes, trying to be there for her, trying to help her restore her relationships. And then we kind of use a term like that to diminish the manhood of my dad. I mean, it's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's like, it's such an insane, reductionist, outrageous way of, like, lens through which to look at the complexity of the relationships and facts that we're talking about, that you know, it says far, far more about the person using that word than it does about the actual situation. Right. Is kind of my perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that's what's so powerful about that story. It's like, as sweet as it might be to like win a pool game, it's like, what does that? It's so insufficient to being a person.
Yeah.
You know,
it takes a tremendous courage and sense of stability in your own manhood and masculinity to be able to just, you know, quickly embrace you as a son. I mean, that's so much more courageous than, you know, hiking Everest
totally.
or whatever.
And that's, you know, as I kind of got to know Jason, I mean, my biological father, who was a presence in my life growing up, and I'd known him all my life, but I didn't know him, you know, as my father until, you know, not that long ago, frankly. And as I got to know him as my biological father, and as I kind of got to understand his relationship with my mother and his views on things, he in some ways embodies that one strain of masculinity. I mean, this sort of the ugly strain, the toxic, whatever one wants to call it, this sort of toughness. I mean, sort of to an extreme. I mean, I would raise some of my conversations with him were unfolding as Me Too movement was gaining traction, and all the Harvey Weinstein stuff. And I raised some of the stuff with him. He was very sympathetic to Harvey Weinstein. He that kind of epitomized that perspective for me. And thinking about really my dad, it totally upended it. My understandings of courage and what it means to be a man. Because here's my dad, this sort of mild-mannered guy who'd been carrying it silently, but he'd made his own peace with it many years ago. And he had the strength and the courage to make peace with it and to love and accept me as his son, whatever else. And so that it floored me. It still does, as just sort of, that's what courage is all about. That's what manhood, I think, is all about. That's what being a good, decent, loving human being is all about.
Yeah. We should get to the advice question in a sec, but listening to you and thinking about what really struck me about your dad is, right, in some ways it's not so hard to be stoic, like to carry something and just suppress everything. But you're right, like that he could take it and be a loving father too is something else entirely, and that just takes a great deal more strength, I think.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to get into the advice question now. I'm just going to go ahead and read it, and then we'll get into it. Hey, man, my wife and I have 2 kids, a 5-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl. My parents are pretty laissez-faire and hands-off as grandparents, but my wife's parents are more intrusive. They often have opinions about our parenting, our children's behavior, and they're quite vocal about it. They always compare what we're doing to how they raised their own children, often with the implication being that they did it better. Sometimes they seem hurt if we reject their opinion or advice in favor of going our own way. Other times they'll just vocally second guess us. Are you really sure you want to do that? We mostly just grit our teeth and bear it. My wife is more used to this from them, and I don't really want conflict with my in-laws. If I ignore them, it usually doesn't escalate, but I'm seething on the inside. How should I be handling this? Signed, Ditmas Park Dad. I think a lot of people can relate to this one.
This feels like one of these almost like unsolvable problems to me.
Yeah, I think
because,
it is.
Because what do you do? What do you do? Like, if you can't ignore them because they view it as being patronized or rejected. You can't take their advice if you disagree with it. So what do? You just kind of have to live.
Well, but there are some, I think, foundational principles that one can reflect on and try to adhere to. I agree with you. I don't think there's like a one size fits all, silver bullet, whatever to this kind of issue. But based on my own experience, at least, a few things are important. One is your kids come first, number one, and their well-being comes first, period. And so whatever needs to be done to preserve, protect, enhance their well-being, that needs to be the priority, even if other people are not that thrilled about that. And boundaries are important. And not surprisingly, the people for whom the boundaries are being erected don't like boundaries. That's kind of the deal.
Yeah.
And there's pushback. And so it's not like you can establish boundaries and everyone's going to be, really excited about it. But boundaries are important. And so I guess what I would say is, as long as you and your wife are on the same page about those boundaries,
that's an important piece.
That's a really important piece. And finding that place where you are on the same page about the boundaries and what those should look like is critical. And understanding that, that's going to have some ripple effects and that you may have to wade through. But I think that, being on the same page about that and creating those boundaries around your family is really important.
It's funny, when we had this question, I was like, oh, this will be a great one. I'm sure we can all relate to it. And now I feel like I don't want to say anything. I don't think you want to say anything. So
well, usually,
I'm like, I wrote a book, so I can,
usually we're full of, well, maybe we can lean on Adam because he's already, in hot water.
Yeah.
No, but I think, so what I'm most curious about, again, asking for a friend.
Yeah.
What I'm most curious about is like, how do you deal with it knowing that like, okay, there's a difficult person who's not going anywhere because she or he is an important part of our family life. They're not going anywhere, but like, they're I'm imagining these people are around the same age as my parents, probably in their late 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Like the window of like they're going through major life changes and their personality dramatically changes is pretty small.
Unlikely, yeah.
They're probably gonna be this way for the rest of their lives on some level. And I'm just trying to like figure out like what advice do you give to people who are struggling with this kind of thing? Just how to deal with it personally. Like, how do you not get re-triggered like you can mentally prepare yourself. All right, there's going to be another time where, my mother-in-law or father-in-law nags me about how I should be sending my kid to synagogue more or going to church more or whatever. Even though we've talked about this 50,000 times, they're going to nag me about it again. How do you not just lose your shit when it happens for the 10 millionth time?
Honestly, well, first of all, I think it's very different for the person who's the child of the parents who are the kind of folks you're thinking about here versus the one who's married to them. Because Steph and I have a different reaction. I am as difficult as things can be. I'm sometimes, as I write in the book, I'm more understanding and almost more sympathetic and and I've tried to say to Steph,
Totally.
she's not trying to act this way. I'm trying to sort of. But
she sees it more clearly.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's very hard. I mean, this is part of the reason why the boundary setting is so important, because there's, it's impossible to not constantly be re-triggered. And so in our case, we would space out my mom's visits, and that's honestly, I love my mom, and it's very important to me and to Steph. That she have a real meaningful relationship with our kids, her grandkids. But as I say in the book, I mean, like the frequent interactions with my mom, and in particular when they sort of begin to involve the family, become very volatile and difficult. And so I found that spacing it out, which obviously there was pushback. Obviously she wasn't happy about that. And obviously that created some other additional issues, but that was the way to do it. It wasn't about, cause you're never going to not be re-triggered. It was more about, creating fewer opportunities to be triggered. And this may be an extreme case, but I do think that's a key part of it. Cause I don't know that the expectation that you will never be re-triggered is a realistic one.
Yeah. I think, the classic thing with boundaries is sort of like, right, you can set a boundary about yourself, not about someone else, right? You can't ask your in-laws not to be assholes. You can just control,
right.
How you engage with them, and maybe that's just less frequency
right.
because
right.
that's the only way you can control them not being assholes to you.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, another thing that again, I'm giving
Broad
all
strokes.
the advice responsibility to Adam here, so I don't have to weighed in personally. But like, I think another thing that I think is potentially helpful in just emotionally dealing with this stuff, without having to write an entire memoir as Adam did, but to participate in a similar kind of project of just trying to understand where your in-law is coming from, trying to understand if they do, especially if they do struggle with something that is bigger than just being a jerk, but is actually maybe something chemical going on, or maybe some actual trauma, such as being the children of Holocaust survivors. Somebody that like, I'm struggling to articulate, because I don't want to say, that this person is not to be taken seriously.
Yeah. Well, no, that's the question is sort of like, where is it coming from? Right. I mean, is it the premise, and part of, I guess, whatever advice I was giving is based on an assumption that you can't actually go and just have a conversation with them.
Right.
And maybe you can. And if you can, that would be the best place to start. Just have an honest, open conversation and say, look, when you guys talk about this stuff and interfere, like, here's the issue with that from our perspective, and try and engage it directly. I think that is the ideal scenario, right? If that's doable. But obviously there may be other stuff going on, and that could be complicated. And I understand that,
I think, another way to think about, I think what you're trying to get at, Sam, is like, I certainly felt this and still feel it since my girls are still young, but like, my wife and I are raising our kids
Avi
differently.
Has 3 daughters.
Yeah. And we're raising them differently from the way either of us were raised. And in that is a kind of implicit criticism, I think, of the way we were raised. And I think that our parents can pick up on that at times, right? If you don't want to repeat your childhood, then what was wrong with your childhood?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes if you can kind of hear I think that the worry that there's like a worry behind the criticism, if they're like, why don't you want to do it this way? Right. It's like, do you think I was a bad parent?
Right.
So I think if you can hold that in your heart, it might sort of soften how you receive their criticism, and also maybe there's an opportunity to show some appreciation for them in some way, so that they don't feel like bad guys.
I think that's very good advice.
Thank you.
I'd go with that one.
I mean,
but I hear you. I think it's tough. I mean, with the issue we're talking about is very common. When I talk to friends, it's like they're facing similar issues.
Yeah,
it's very
common.
rare.
Yeah.
Listen, we have a lot of parents across our. I mean, with all the divorces, all the biological or non-biological. There's like a lot of parents here. But that's a separate question from from the one you're asking, I think, which is like, who are you most comfortable with and spending time with the kids and all of this stuff. Steph's mother's a therapist, and one of her kind of principles is you can either change the situation or you can change your reaction in response to the situation. And I think in these sorts of things, it is ideally you can have that. I think there's wise advice, Avi, about like understanding where they're coming from. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to hold that in your heart and also share with them. I mean, one of the things that I think has lightened this whole experience for me was just my mother reading the book, honestly, whatever her reaction, because I had so much to say to her for so long that added tension to all of our interactions. And her just reading the book, I no longer had anything to say to her. She read it. And so to me, at least, it sort of lightened me up around her. And I think that's obviously, I'm not suggesting everyone go out and write a book about their parents or in-laws, but I think there is a way in which sometimes the inability to communicate all of that stuff directly just aggravates the issues and feeds the tension.
Something else that I was thinking about when I saw that we were going to do this question is I was like, sort of in the way that I still don't entirely feel like a grown-up. Like I have 3 kids, right? And one of them is 7. So I've been at this now for like a little while. Like I think of my parents as parents. I'm not sure that I always think of myself as on the same level.
Yeah.
And I think that,
I totally hear you.
And that there's something, I'm like God bless my youngest. Like in a way, I'd like to think I'd be the most prepared for her, but I'm also like the tiredest. So anything I've learned, I can't really use because I'm like too exhausted and wiped out to do it. So it's like, and they're constantly changing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you're done. And so like, I sort of feel like, how satisfying must it be to be a grandparent and everything you learned, you finally like can point it out and see, like it's your only chance to do it right. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, or do what you wish you could do. So like, I can totally relate to the impulse of like wanting to get it right and give someone advice.
That's a great point. I mean, and as you were saying that, and as I was rethinking the question, I'm realizing like, I want to keep this in mind for when I become, hopefully someday a grandparent. Of course, we're gonna wanna weigh in on stuff. Like we're gonna have to probably hold our tongues all the time. And by the way, both my parents and my in-laws, to their great credit, I'm sure hold their tongues all the time. Because definitely we're not raising our kids to, in a way that is like the dream way that either of our sets of parents would hope we would have raised our kids, I think. And but as I was thinking about that, I was also just thinking about like maybe like another jujitsu move could be like having the loving attitude and seeing the parent or the in-law as a whole person who's a bundle of faults and strengths. And simply like, and again, this is hard to do. You have to be like a borderline Mother Teresa to be this good, but like, I think like, even when they're giving you advice that you hate, like saying something to the effect of like, I appreciate how much you love your grandchildren and want them to be raised well.
And,
and I see that you love them and care about them. And that moves me that you love them, you know? And I think because you're absolutely right. Listen, it must be super hard, especially like, you know, again, without going into any details, like, I mean, especially for parents, let's say, who are religious and their grandchildren aren't being raised religiously, like that kind of thing must be such a stab in the heart for some people of like, wow, you must hate me if like the one of the main ways that I raised you have rejected and are not raising your kids that way. And so that's why I think it's like important to like reiterate, no, we don't hate you. We love you. We're just doing something different.
Yeah.
Do you have a piece of advice? You're a big reader, I know, and you've read a lot of great works probably that have great advice. So you probably have a bunch in your head, but is there any particular line from something you've read or something somebody important in your life has told you that has stuck with you? And
I was thinking, I was thinking about this. I think that the best advice is the simplest that I could offer, which is the epigraph of the third part of my book, which is the inscription above the entryway at the oracle at Delphi, the Temple of Apollo, which was "Know thyself." And I think it's sort of interesting that was the inscription at an oracle, where people went to know their futures. Right? You go to an oracle to sort of understand what's in store for you and what lies ahead. And that was the inscription is sort of worth reflecting on, because what it says to me is that the only way we can begin to understand our future and what's in store is if we really understand ourselves. And you know, as at least in my experience, the process of that kind of self-understanding and discovery is not easy. It's painful. It can be terrible for long periods of time. But the reward is immeasurable.
So tell people once more the name of your book, where they can find you on social media, all that good stuff. And
the name of the book is The Survivors: A Story of War, Inheritance, and Healing. And you can find me at AP Frankel, Frankel on Twitter. And you can buy the book on Amazon or your local independent bookstore or wherever.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam.
Awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. All right, that's it for our show this week. Thanks everyone for listening. If you have a question that you want some advice on, please email us at heymanpod@gmail.com, or better yet, give us a call, 917-426-4326, and leave us a voicemail. All questions, if they make it on the show, are anonymous. No need to worry. You can follow us on Instagram or Twitter at heymanpod, and if you have a moment, give us a review, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts, and better yet, click subscribe. Thanks so much. Have a great week. Peace.